All right, thanks everybody for coming. Migrate to the vCenter server appliance you should. Here's the normal disclaimer that you've gotten accustomed to throughout the week. Here's today's agenda. So we're going to do quick introductions. We're going to go over a migration interview. We're going to talk about automation, especially when it relates to migration. Alternative VCSA migration paths. So what can you do if you can't use the actual migration tool? And then we're going to have Q&A. So quick introduction. My name is Ahmad Yunus. I'm a senior technical marketing engineer at VMware. I cover the vCenter server appliance, cover vCenter server migrations going from Windows to the appliance, also VMware Cloud on AWS.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is William Lam. I'm a staff architect working within our integrated systems business unit at VMware. Lately, I've been focusing around improving our product lifecycle management. So this includes things like install, patch, upgrade of our products. I have a personal blog on virtuallyghetto.com, and you can also reach out to me on Twitter.
Cool. All right, so let's jump right in and cover the migration overview. I don't know if you guys have heard, but right before VMworld US, we had an announcement about Windows. Windows is being deprecated. How many of you are aware of this announcement? Okay, good majority of the room. Okay. So if you go out to the following URL, you'll actually see the announcement. So you have at least one more major release before we actually deprecate Windows vCenter Server.
So how many of you in here are Windows vCenter server huggers? Okay. And how many of you guys are going to be looking at converting over to the appliance? Excellent. Awesome.
Our job is done here.
Yeah, exactly.
Just walk away, right?
You guys are doing a job for us.
By the way, please go to the URL, and there is a survey down at the bottom. The PMs, right in the room, are looking for feedback, not only for what is preventing you from going to the appliance, but any features that you feel are still lacking within the appliance. So all feedback is welcome, good or bad. All right, so let's talk about the actual migration overview with the tool. You have two steps when you're migrating. The first step is using the actual migration assistant. And what the migration assistant does is it goes out and does the pre-checks on your environment before you can actually start the migration process. It wants to validate that this environment is ready to be migrated. The other thing it does is it actually copies the data from the source Windows vCenter server to the vCenter server appliance. So it needs to remain running throughout the migration process. We'll actually shut it down after the data is copied from the source Windows vCenter, so you don't have to do anything there. The next step is the actual migration tool, which lives on the vCenter server appliance ISO. So you'll mount that ISO to a machine that has a routable network to the vCenter server. You'll just fire up the UI and you'll click Migrate. And now you're going to walk through the actual migration wizard. The first stage is going to deploy the appliance. The second stage is actually going to configure the appliance and then layer on top the configuration from the source Windows vCenter server. So at the end, you wind up with a vCenter server appliance that has the same identity as your Windows vCenter server. So name, IP address, UUID, MOREF, certificates, all come over. And that's huge with the UUID because any solution that talks to vCenter server as an endpoint now knows no different. It's the same old vCenter server. So instead of just talking about this, what if we go through a demo? So here I've mounted the ISO, and I'm entering in my SSO credentials that are from when I log into the PSC. As you can see here, here's my migration assistant. And it's giving me a ton of information. Things like what's registered to vCenter, the environment size, the FQDN IP, all that information is visible here. And at the end, it's going to tell you, do not close, waiting for the migration process to start. It's that simple. Next, I'm going to go to a machine on a routable network, and I'm going to start the migration process. And I'm just going through a wizard. And if you've ever deployed the vCenter server appliance in 6.5, it's really the same wizard with the exception of one screen, and I'll point that out. But here I'm going through and entering in the source Windows vCenter that I want to migrate. And then next, I'm actually saying the target, where am I deploying to? And I have the option of deploying either to an ESXi host, or if I have a management vCenter server, I can actually deploy to that as well. So here I'm just entering in my credentials, all the information, going through the certificates, and now I'm selecting where I'm deploying to as far as the folder. I deployed to an ESXi host there. So now I'm just, again, selecting cluster, all that stuff. So the normal things that you see when you're deploying an appliance. Now I'm giving it a name. So your Windows vCenter server has a host name, right? There's also a display name tied to that. Again, as part of the identity, I'm bringing over that host name, but the appliance will get a different display name. So I have the option here of using a new name, or if I want to use the existing name, I can go out, put like -old for the display name on the current one, and now I can use the existing name. So that's up to you. But the name here is just the display name because we are retaining the host name. So here I'm just giving it a random name, entering in my password. And as far as size, you can select the same size that you have today. And again, coming from Windows, the migration assistant will tell you what size you are. So you can select the same size, or here you have the option to increase your size. So here I'm keeping the defaults. And now selecting the data store, again, just like the migration. And now I'm providing a temporary IP address. Again, remember, because I need to bring the appliance up at the same time as the Windows machine, I have to give it this temporary IP address so they can be up at the same time. Once we copy the data, then we'll be able to shut down the Windows vCenter, and we'll migrate the identity over, and it will take the IP address and the FQDN. So now it's going through, again, stage 1, deploying the vCenter server. Now that's finished. And now we're going to stage 2. So we're going to configure, and then we're going to layer on top the migration. So I'm going to fast forward through this just for time. One thing I want to point out here is if you look at I think I fast forwarded too fast. Okay, so here real quick, it's going to warn you again that you have some things installed on the Windows vCenter server, so we will be shutting down. Once we shut down, you'll no longer have access to that. So make sure you're aware of what's installed on vCenter before you actually do the migration. The other thing I want to show real quick is during the migration process, you can go back to the migration assistant, and it's going to show you what's actually taking place until we shut down the vCenter server. So that is your source of truth. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to fast forward. And here, now I'm logging in, and now I've migrated from Windows to the appliance. This video is actually up on YouTube, and we have it up on our website, so don't worry, we'll give you some links later on. All right.
Cool. Thanks, Ahmad.
Yep.
So kind of what Ahmad showed you, like I said, this is a pretty straightforward tool. There's a lot of resources on it. In fact, we even have a GitHub repository that has all this information, YouTube videos, walkthrough demos, and we'll share some of that towards the end. So what Ahmad showed you is using the UI to go through this process of migrating from a Windows vCenter server over to the appliance. I wanted to quickly highlight some of the automation capabilities that we've had since 6.0. We can actually fully manage the entire lifecycle management of the VCSA. So whether that's install, migrate, or upgrade, we have the ability to automate this using the CLI. And it takes in a very small JSON file. Here's an example of the configuration file. And the nice thing about this is you can actually source control this, right? And so you can actually parameterize this. And this becomes a very easy way for you to automatically deploy the appliance. So rather than going through all the clicks that Imad was showing, you fill in the options that you want, whether you're doing a brand new installation, if you're doing an upgrade, or you're doing a migration, you can completely automate this. Really quickly, when you download the vCenter Server Appliance ISO, you can extract the file. There's a directory structure called the CLI installer. Within that directory, there's a templates directory, and then that's broken out by the different operations, whether it's install, upgrade, and migrate. And within each of these folder directories, we actually have a JSON sample of all the different combinations, whether it's a standalone PSC, a vCenter Server Appliance embedded, Windows, and all those templates that's provided to you as an example. And so you can take one of these files, replace it with your environment information, run the CLI tool, and then the process is completely automated, and you can step away and have a drink or something. Another thing to worth mention is that this CLI utility is multi-platform. So the screenshot here I've shown is running on my Mac, but you can actually run this on both Windows, Mac, as well as Linux. So any of the platforms you can use for automation purposes. So now we're going to really jump into the main sort of portion of the presentation, right? We kind of showed the migration utility is very easy, straightforward to use. We've spoken to a lot of customers who've successfully migrated. But now we want to shift gears a little bit and kind of take a look at some of the scenarios where customers were not able to take advantage of VMware's migration tool, yet they still want to go to the appliance. And we're going to cover some of these scenarios. And we'd love to kind of get your feedback to see, if you guys are in any of these scenarios where you would like to go to the vCenter Server Appliance, but you might be in one of these particular scenarios that prevents you from using the official tool. And then we'll kind of take you through our thought processes of what you might want to consider and give you some options on how you can migrate from the Windows vCenter Server over to the appliance. So the first scenario that we're going to be covering is this thing that we're calling horizontal migration. Here, where I can be starting off with a vCenter Server Windows, whether it's 6.0 or 6.5, and I want to migrate from a Windows-based server over to the appliance. And this is known as a horizontal migration. Basically, I'm trying to go from like to like version of the vCenter Server Appliance and the Windows vCenter Server. And this is not officially supported today. The reason for this is that when you use the VCSA migration tool, it's actually two steps in one. The first process is we're changing the platform from Windows to the appliance, but we're also performing an upgrade. So you can go from a 5.5 environment, and I can go to a 6.0 because that's an upgrade, right? So I can actually migrate from a Windows 5.5 over to 6.0 perfectly fine. I can migrate from a 6.0 to a 6.5. But let's say you're running a Windows vCenter Server 6.5 today, and you say, I want to go to the appliance. You wouldn't be able to take that path because, again, it's both a migration as well as an upgrade. So that's known as a horizontal migration today, and that's not something that's available in the tool.
So who here today is in this scenario?
Show of hands. Okay.
Okay.
Scenario number 2 is what we're calling consolidation. You might start off with multiple Windows vCenter servers. This could be multiple sites, just growing the environments. And what you really want is now I have these systems, now I want to consolidate that to a single VCSA. The topology doesn't really matter here, so you might have some embedded deployments, you have some multiple external deployments, and I still want to consolidate. The issue here is that the VCSA migration tool is a one-to-one mapping. It's one vCenter server to the destination of the VCSA. So if you have 3 different windows, we can only convert one of them, and the other 2 would have to be converted to their own independent VCSA. So you wouldn't be able to have this particular scenario.
Okay, by a show of hands, who's in this scenario?
Okay, just a couple.
Yeah.
And then lastly, the scenario number 3 is what we're referring to as a topology change. Here we're going from a external platform services controller. Again, this is running Windows, and my destination is a embedded VCSA. Another option could be I could be starting out with an embedded Windows vCenter server, and then I want to move to a VCSA that has an external PSC. And here the challenge here is that the VCSA migration tool does not change the topology. We're already moving the platform, which is one significant change for the customers. We're also upgrading the software, and so we don't want to touch the topology, right? So one of the things that you can do is that you can either change the topology prior to migration, and depending on the version of vSphere that you're running, if you're running, say, 5.5, it's a little bit more flexible in terms of changing that topology, but if you're running 6.0, there's less flexibility. The other option is you can then migrate first, and then change the topology afterwards. So for example, I might go from an embedded to an embedded appliance, and then I want to go from an embedded to an external right? So the topology change isn't supported throughout the migration process, but you can either do it before the migration or you can do it after the migration.
Okay, who's in this scenario?
Okay, a couple more hands for this one, okay?
All right, so we covered 3 scenarios, and it looks like it's kind of a tie between the horizontal migration, right, and then the consolidation.
Yeah. Does that kind of recap where folks are in this room in terms of some of the scenarios that we ran through? Were there any ones that we haven't covered that you feel are missing from the slides? No? Okay.
So in talking to a few of you this week, host name came up. Basically, you have a name tied to your operating system. So, for example, WinVC01, and now you're going to a Linux appliance, right? So that host name is going to come over as WinVC01, but that doesn't comply with your naming scheme. Does anybody fall into that? Okay.
More hands.
All right. So now we're going to talk about the considerations that you should take when doing a migration. As William and I were putting this session together, we wanted to come up with a simple framework that was easy for anybody to pick up and use when doing a migration. So here you can see what we kind of looks like a Simon Says board game type. And we have vCenter server, we have ESXi hosts, we have vCenter solutions, basically anything talking to vCenter as an endpoint. And then we have the actual workloads, the virtual machines. So, William, you up for playing a quick game?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So, first framework that we're going to talk about or consideration is the vCenter server side. So, I have an environment today, and I want to do a migration. And all I really care about is certain key things that I want to bring over. So, for example, I want to bring over tags. I want to bring over things like my DRS configuration, etc. Right? But I don't want everything else to come over for this particular environment. What do you recommend there?
Yeah, so you have a couple of options here, right? So when we're talking about vCenter server, we're really talking about all the different configurations that you care about. And there may be scenarios where there are certain environments where you only need specific things like Imad said. So things like maybe tags, folders, and permissions. And everything else you may say, I don't need that information. That vCenter might be really old, and I only really care about very specific things. And we have some recommendations for that. For environments where there might be a little bit larger and you want all that information, there are some other things to consider. So for the simple environment where, like Imad said, I just want tags and maybe I want some DRS rules, you have 2 options. Obviously, I always recommend automating it, but if you just have one vCenter server, it might be worthwhile to just kind of manually export some of those things by hand, right? Export the tags, export the rules, recreate that in the brand new vCenter server, right? Because in all 3 of those scenarios, you're deploying a brand new vCenter server appliance, right? So it can be up and running side by side if you don't need to reuse the FQDN of the vCenter server. And you can either do that by hand. Obviously, if you have more than one, or you want to ensure that there's no human error, obviously you want to automate that. And there's a lot of scripts out in the community that allows you to export this information out there and then re-import that into the new vCenter server. For a much larger complex environment where you're going to want to capture a lot more information, we really highly recommend using automation. Some tricks that you can potentially leverage is that if you have an environment that was not configured in enhanced linked mode where I have a vCenter server with an external PSC and you want to keep that same topology as your destination, one of the tricks that you can do is you can deploy a VCSA PSC and actually join the existing Windows domain in terms of an SSO domain. And the benefit there is that if you only care about things like tags, roles, and permissions, one of the nice capability of enhanced linked mode is that once you're joined as part of that single SSO domain, all that metadata automatically gets replicated for you, right? So you can actually use this little trick here to replicate some of the basic things that Imad cares about. And once you've converted that information over, you can then break that into hand links mode. So you're really leveraging that as a way to automatically replicate information that you care about. So you don't have to manually do it. You don't need to manually write some script. So there are a couple of tricks here and there that allows you to get some of that information if you really care about that stuff. But the general recommendation is leverage automation. There's a lot of content out in the community that you can leverage. Either myself, Alan Renouf, Luke Deakins have written that allows you to export very specific things. You can then apply that. And then there are scripts like vcheck and other options where you can rerun that against your environment and make sure that I exported 100 tags. Do I actually have those 100 tags re-imported into my environment?
Okay, that sounds good. But in my two environments, I have one machine where I named it specifically for the OS, so WinVC 01. But I have another vCenter where I'm okay with the name, but I need to change the IP address. What do you recommend?
Right. So this one comes up quite a lot, and it sounds like this week this is a scenario where many of you are still faced with. So a lot of customers do, name their host name based on the platform. And so for the changing the host name, it's actually pretty straightforward. Like I said, in all three scenarios, you're deploying a brand new vCenter server appliance. And so if your source Windows vCenter, its host name is tied to its platform, you can use a completely brand new host name altogether. There are no conflicts at all. So that's a pretty straightforward use case, right? So you deploy the new VCSA using the brand new hosting that you want to use. Once you migrate everything over, you can then decommission the old vCenter server. Now, if you want to replace the IP address and say, hey, I actually like the host name, but I want to change the IP address because I've ran out of network information, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to export the information on your source Windows vCenter server first, right? Because I want to use that IP address eventually. Update your DNS, right, with the new IP address, right? Because we want to keep the host name, but I just want to switch the IP address. So I need to export all the information I care about in my source Windows vCenter server, power it down. I then update DNS with the new IP address while retaining the FQDN. And so that in that scenario, you're only having one vCenter up and running at one point in time. So here's a case where you do need to export all the information you care about before you start using the new vCenter server. So these are kind of some things to consider when you're dealing with potential network changes, whether it's the host name or the IP address.
Okay, so as you're talking through this, I'm thinking, every time I deploy a new vCenter, it gets a unique identifier, right? Should I worry that at some point I could actually have two vCenters up at the same time with the same ID?
Yeah, it's definitely a possibility. So there are these IDs, there are 64 IDs, and when you deploy a vCenter, one gets randomly generated. If you only have a couple of vCenter server, this is really something that you shouldn't have to worry about. And in fact, less than 0.001% of our customers actually even potentially have this problem. And it's really for customers deploying a lot of vCenter servers, doing high churn. So I'm talking 10,000 VMs per day. And so the reason this is interesting is that this ID with a bunch of other information is the way that vCenter server uses to generate virtual machine MAC addresses, right? So you can understand if I have two vCenter servers with the same VC ID, there's a chance, right, because it's still randomized, that you could have two MAC addresses that potentially conflict, and we all know that that's not going to be good for your application. Now the good news on that is, like I said, the risk is very, very low. You can actually query for this information. So any virtual center version that you're running, you can actually query this using the UI, or you can query it using the API. So that's one option. We also have a built-in VM MAC address detection mechanism that's automatically enabled as an alarm. So if you have any kind of potential MAC address conflicts, the alarm will automatically get raised. And you can also write a quick Power CLI script, and there's even some code that has already been published on the internet, to basically go through your inventory of your VMs and say, for each of these vCenter server, pull out all the MAC addresses, and are there any potential duplicates? So this can even be a health check that you run periodically to ensure that you didn't accidentally deploy a vCenter server with the same ID and some MACs might be generated. So it's not really something that you really need to worry about, but it's something just to be aware of.
Okay. So here we have some solutions that William was talking about. So we have the import, export settings from one vCenter server to another. There's the link there. If you want to actually get the tags that you're using in your current vCenter server and then restore them to another one, we have that there. Then we have the vDocumentation, which some of the community members have been working on.
Yeah, so this is a great way of, so Ariel Sanchez has recently created this, doing it with the community. I think maybe even some of you guys have contributed, but it's a nice way to basically document what's there, right? So this can be useful just to say what you have deployed, but this is a great way to validate that if I exported a certain amount of information out of my source Windows vCenter server, I've re-imported into my new VC, are the environments actually matching up, right? Do I have the same number of tags? Do I have the same number of permissions, roles, all that information? So this is a really great open source script that is very modular. And you can deploy your environment, run this script and it can be a report for your environment. And then lastly, RV Tools is another popular tool out there. It's just a UI-based tool, so if you're not comfortable using the CLI, you'd rather have a GUI utility, this is an open source one. And again, these are just examples of what's out there in the community. There's just so much content out there, so don't reinvent the wheel. Take a look at what folks have built out there and kind of contribute back.
Sounds good. I think we've covered a good amount. I'm pretty comfortable with my vCenter configuration now. Anything else you guys feel we missed or you fall under a different category? Yep.
Some time ago, I saw that one of our vCenters was initially configured with an IP instead of a host name, instead of a fully qualified domain name. And yeah, which is a problem for migrations, as I cannot change the IP of the vCenter. So I was wondering, with this migration tool or with the appliance, if there's a possibility to adjust the IP to a fully qualified domain name.
Yeah, unfortunately, the question is if I've deployed vCenter server with an IP versus the fully qualified name, can I go back and change that IP to a fully qualified name?
Yes.
Unfortunately, once you deploy via IP address, there's no way to go back and change it because now that IP is also the FQDN, right? So now you're going to have to go in and do some of the things that William was talking about, stand up a new appliance with the FQDN, and now you'll be able to pull out whatever data you need.
Yeah, okay.
It's a good one. All right, so let's move along. Let's talk about ESXi hosts. So William, I have, again, two environments, one with existing hosts, right? And I'm standing up a new appliance, and I need to bring the hosts over with the VMs running hot, right? But I also have another environment where I've already built out the vCenter server. I've added new hardware because I'm doing a hardware refresh at this time. So I got to start deploying workloads on that. But I also need to bring other things over as well. What are your recommendations there?
Yeah, so let's take the second use case for now. You provision a brand new environment, so you have your new VCSA, you've got brand new hardware, can take advantage of all the brand new capabilities, and you need to start consuming that environment immediately. But you cannot move all of your hosts from your old vCenter over immediately, you can move it over time. One of the things to really consider is that if you want to live migrate those VMs eventually onto that new set of hardware, one thing to really keep consideration is around EVC. And ensuring that you set up EVC initially on the cluster and setting up the baseline of your old host, right? So that way we have compatibility as the lowest common denominator so that when you are ready to move those VMs across, you will be able to leverage our vMotion capability to easily migrate between clusters within a vCenter. So that's something really important. It's something that folks forget about. They're like, we'll swing the host over, have two different EVC modes, and then you have to actually shut the VMs down to power off. In the first scenario, where it might say like, hey, we got some brand new infrastructure, I just want to use it. It's a very similar concept to whether you're doing existing VC or new VC, which is you can either reprovision the host if you're using something like auto deploy host profiles, right? You've already captured the configuration, so you don't need to back anything up from your source Windows, your source ESXi host, right? It's kind of automated for you. But if you're not leveraging those technologies or you're manually building your ESXi host, then there are some things to consider. You can either swing the host hot across, so whether you're using a standard switch, you can use that configuration. If you're doing a distributed virtual switch, you can also swing the host across, right? So it's as simple as disconnecting the ESXi host from your source Windows vCenter server and then reconnecting that to the new VCSA. Now, the only thing to be aware of is that if you're doing LACP, those tricks will not work. There's a workflow that you need to follow. Anybody using LACP today or lags in your environments? Okay. So if you're doing LACP, you can't just disconnect the host and reconnect it, right? It's just not going to work, and you potentially can PSOD your environments. For the other two scenarios, you can disconnect the host, reconnect it. VMs are still running. There's no impact to your infrastructure. For LACP, you're going to want to basically take one of the NICs, take it out of the LACP bundle, put it into standby mode, and what that does, you can actually remove the NIC, but if you put it into standby mode, it's going to slowly release the flows of the network flows that exist. If you just disconnect the NIC, any kind of existing network traffic flows will just get axed out. So if your application is not highly available or is potentially network sensitive, you may have some potential ping loss there. So by putting the NIC into standby mode, you're releasing those flows slowly. And what that allows you to do is you now have one NIC that's no longer connected to your LACP or your VDS. You now create a brand new standard switch, right? And that gives you one PNIC onto your standard switch. You can then start to migrate your management interfaces if they're on the VDS, migrate all your virtual machines onto the standard switch, and then we go ahead and disconnect the other physical NIC from your LACP bundle, and now you're back onto a standard switch where no LACP is being configured. You then swing the ESXi host across to the new vCenter server, and we reverse that exact same workflow. We then take one of those NICs, recreate a brand new VDS, I migrate my VM kernel interfaces across, I migrate my virtual machines across, and then I take that last PNIC from my standard switch, and I reconnect it to my VDS. So it's a little bit of work. It's not as straightforward as standard switches, so that's one of the reasons we really recommend using a VMware standard switch. But there is a workflow in process, and the best thing about this is that you can automate it, right? So once you've done the thorough testing in your lab environments, you can then write a little script that'll automatically do that for you, so you don't have to think about this, because it is a lot of clicks within our web client UI. So something to consider if you're doing LACP.
Sounds good. And again, down here we have some solutions. So if you're using auto deploy or host profiles, you can import them and then export them. There's various scripts within the community, as William mentioned, so you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can just do a quick Google search and you'll find some of those. Again, vDocumentation, so you can compare and contrast. vCheck, again, another good tool where it's more of a reporting, but again, good to find out what's going on within your environment. The last two are, again, the examples that William was talking about, going from a standard switch to a distributed switch in your main source Windows vCenter, and then when you migrate, you're going to do the reverse. So these are two scripts that William actually has out there that will do that for you. So you don't have to do the manual option. All right, so now let's talk about the actual solutions that are talking to my Windows vCenter server. So anything that is talking to vCenter as an endpoint falls under this category. So plugins, other applications such as, like, let's say VRA, NSX, things like that will fall here. So William, in my current environment, I have SRM, right? I have some storage plugins that are also running on my vCenter server, and I have NSX. When I migrate, I know that there's going to be if I'm using the tool, the UID stays in place, so no issues there. But in this case, I can't use the tool.
Right. In this scenario, because we have a brand new vCenter server appliance being deployed, it has its own UUID. Any of the VMware solutions or third-party solutions, the way that they uniquely identify a vCenter server is through this UUID, right? And because we're deploying a brand new vCenter server, those plugins will no longer work. Things like backups, SRM, VDP, any of these solutions, whether it's VMware or third-party solutions. So in the majority of the cases, you're going to have to do something with these solutions. Either reinstall them, right? In the case of SRM, it is going to be reinstalling the application, repointing that to the brand new vCenter server appliance to make sure that all that is configured. Some other solutions like NSX are a little bit more nicer, where you can actually just re-register the vCenter server. So before, my NSX manager might be talking to my Windows vCenter server, I just log into an NSX manager and re-register that with the new VCSA, and everything just works again. You still need to recreate the controllers, right? So none of that will automatically work. So this is something that you need to do a little bit of research on, especially if you're using third-party solutions, and check with your vendors in terms of compatibility and what are some of the options that they provide, whether it's going to require reinstallation or is it just a re-registration. So something to keep aware of, especially around VM backups, right? We might move all these workloads across, and then we forget to set up backups on our new infrastructure because we thought that all the plugins and solutions were still functional.
Yeah, and to add to that, you're also doing an upgrade here. So any solution, when you're going to the 6.5, you need to make sure that it's compatible with that during the upgrade process. Again, some solutions are, we have a list of vCenter plugins that you can find. There's the link, but you can also use, again, the migration assistant itself. You can just run it. It will give you a list of what's registered on vCenter, and then once you get that list, now you're aware of what's there, you can just close the migration assistant. So you don't have to go any further, but it's actually a good tool to use just to get a sense of what's going on in your environment.
And both of these use the vSphere API, so it just depends on what you're comfortable with. If you want to use the VMware tool as a way to basically get a list of the different plugins you've deployed, this is one easy way. If you want to say, I want to do this across, maybe 10, 20 different vCenter servers, and I don't want to manually run this utility, you can use the script that I wrote. But they both query the exact same information.
Okay, so the most important piece, the workloads themselves, right? So, we talked about the two different environments that I have, and in one instance, I have existing workloads that I just want to migrate over. In the other instance, I have new workloads. So what can I do to make sure that as I'm doing this manual type of migration, and of course, I'm going to automate it, right? Because I don't want to have to do it over and over again. What can I do to ensure that everything comes over smoothly, and if I can minimize downtime?
So obviously this is really going to depend on the use case and your SLAs with your customers and your workloads, right? You may have some workloads from your old existing vCenter server dev test. They're not very critical VMs, and you may not need to move them while they're powered on. And in those scenarios, it's a very simple export, re-import. Very common other mechanisms of using some type of shared storage, right? So if I have NFS or Fiber Channel that is exposing storage to both my old infrastructure as well as my new infrastructure, right? It's simply re-registering that virtual machine, right? But it's still causing some downtime. I can also do a LUN swing, obviously exporting all the VMs to a single LUN and then representing that. Again, there's still downtime, but for VMs that don't require any type of being up and running, this is a very quick way, right? Because you're not having to migrate the VMs. Now, for the scenarios where you do need to migrate your workloads while they're running, you can't take the downtime because of scheduling with the application, or it becomes very tricky. And if you have 10,000 VMs, you can see that this can take a while, right? One of the really cool capabilities that was introduced in vSphere 6.0 is this concept of cross vCenter vMotion. How many of you guys have used that capability before? And so you generally use this feature through the UI, right? So you have two vCenter servers connected to the same SSO domain, and you're able to migrate a live running virtual machine between one vCenter server to another. Now, there's a little bit of a misnomer, is that the requirement is that your vCenter servers do not need to be in the same SSO domain. So let me repeat that one more time. The vCenter servers do not need to be in the same SSO domain for you to take advantage of this cross vCenter vMotion capability. The caveat is that to do that, you need it for the UI. But if you wanted to migrate a live running virtual machine from one vCenter server to another vCenter server that's on two completely different SSO domains, they can be deployed in two completely different topologies. We've had that capability since vSphere 6.0. And that capability is actually built into the core vMotion capability as from an API standpoint. So obviously the UI uses the API to migrate it, but one of its constraints is that we require enhanced linked mode to be able to see the vCenter servers in our UI. Our UI cannot just connect to two different SSO domains. So I've written a script here that allows you to perform this migration while your VMs are running. Obviously you need to ensure that you have that VM network traffic, whether it's a stretched L2, it's an overlay network, or an NSX virtual wire, but you can actually live migrate that virtual machine across two vCenter servers between a 6.0 environment to a 6.5, or like for like. So it can be a 6.5 to 6.5 or 6.0 to 6.0. And I've actually talked to a number of customers at VMworld US a couple weeks back where they've been using this capability for data center migration. So they're not even using it for Windows to VCSA migration. They're going from consolidation scenarios. They want to evacuate one data center to another. And they were moving 6,500 VMs with one customer. Another one just moved 4,000 VMs, right? So this is a really easy way, leveraging some automation and the platform to be able to migrate running virtual machines and not be tied down with having to be part of the same SSO domain, which is generally a constraint that many of our customers have, is that they don't have everything configured for linked mode. So the good news is you don't need linked mode to use this capability. It's only exposed to the APIs. And one of the changes that we did in one of the Power CLI releases recently was to update the move VM commandlet to actually expose this capability. So my script has a little bit more bells and whistles to it, but if you wanted just the really basic capabilities, you can actually use Power CLI and just use the move VM capability to perform this cross vCenter vMotion.
And then we have content library. Who here is actually using content library today?
A few of you.
Okay. Yeah, so you can leverage content library as well to, import the VMs and then export them as well.
Yeah, the nice thing about content library is it's a kind of like a free replication mechanism. It requires a little bit of downtime, but you take all your VMs, you create a library, and it becomes your publisher. That's going to be your source Windows vCenter server. When you stand up your new VCSA, you then subscribe to that publisher. And once you create that association, automatically vCenters will talk to each other and set up that replication for you. And so if you have 100 gigabytes of storage or terabytes of storage, you can set all those VMs up, set up the subscribing, walk away, and that information is automatically synced for you, and then you can disconnect the content library, and then you can kind of get rid of your source vCenter server. So it's another nice capability that's there. There's no additional licensing. If you're using 6.0 or greater, you guys have that capability. So definitely take advantage of that for content replication, but you can also take advantage of it from moving your workloads from one Windows vCenter server over to the appliance.
So you said something that kind of, we were talking about backups and we were talking about swinging things over from one vCenter to the other. I'm starting to get a little paranoid, right? I want to make sure that at the end of the day, if something does happen, I have my backup plan because I have to put in a change control, right? I like the idea of the cross vCenter vMotion because I can go from 6.0 to 6.5. But if something happens, can I go the other way?
Right. So it's one of these capabilities that we can go forward. So I can go from 6.0 to 6.0, I can go from 6.5 to 6.5, I can go from 6.0 to 6.5, but I can't go backwards, obviously, right? Because the vCenter 6.5 is not going to know anything about the old 6.0 environment. So your backup plan is that if you do need to put those VMs back, you can still rely on the traditional export import functionality, right? So I can take that VM that was imported into my 6.5 environment and just export that back out and re-import that in.
Sounds good. I think we covered a lot. I'm starting to feel pretty comfortable about doing this manual migration, but now in an automated fashion,
right, of course,
versus the clicks, right? Otherwise, you're going to come after me. So what is your last piece of recommendation?
So this one's actually really, really important. Test. No matter what we say, what Imad says, or scripts that you find on the internet, you guys really need to test this environment out, see what's in your environment, and discover this information out there. So, the recommendation is try to replicate as much of this in a dev environment as possible. Get the workflow. It's also a great opportunity to get familiar with the manual process. You can then start building your automation, and once that works, you can easily point that to some of your environments and do that automation. So again, none of the things that we've said replaces customers actually testing, right?
Cool. So we've talked about how to do all this in a automated fashion, right? So kind of theory behind it. But what we're going to show you now is actually a live demo in a live environment where we're going to do a migration automated, right? But we're going to do horizontal because we have a Windows vCenter server on 6.5, and we're going to go to a vCenter server appliance 6.5. We're also external. And we want to go to embedded because we're lazy and we want to keep things simple. So William's going to go through some of the scripts that we're using to accomplish this.
I'm crossing my finger that I can run this live demo. I'm sure you guys don't want to watch another video. But this is running in the US. So I'm having a little bit of latency. Apparently this is a big pond that I got to jump over. So here in this environment here, what I'm showing you is the Windows vCenter server. This is a 6.5 environment. So here I can have an external PSC and then have my vCenter server. And I've got some VMs on here, obviously. So I have some workloads. I have some VMs that are powered on, some that are powered off, right? Now, if I click onto one of these VMs, this is actual VM, so these are some Photon OS VMs. You can see it has an IP address. And I've got some tags associated to this VM, right? So some really important application owners and system owners. I've also got some DRS cluster rules, right? I got some anti-affinity rules. I want to make sure that I don't run my finance applications with my engineering application. So let's take a look at some of the DRS rules that we've got deployed here. Here we can see some cluster rules that I've defined here for a couple of my groups of VMs. And then I also have some host group rule, so some decent amount of information, right? If I go over to my VM structure, you can see that I've got some folder structures that I've set up for my VMs that are nicely configured. And I want to preserve all this stuff, right? You don't want to rebuild this stuff by hand. And then lastly, we will just take a look at some of the tag information real quick. How are we doing on time?
We're good.
Okay. So you can see I've got a bunch of tags here and a bunch of categories. So we have quite a bit of information, right? And you may not need all this information. You may want all of this, but again, it's just to kind of give you an idea. So now I've deployed my VCSA. So this is my 6.5 environment. Let's take a look at that environment real quick.
One thing to note here is we're actually using the Flex client. So just keep that in the back of your mind for right now. You'll see why I mentioned this later on.
Okay, so now we're logged into our 6.5 VCSA. I've got some hosts, right, because I've got some brand new capacity. I want to take advantage of vSAN. And there's nothing configured here. It's an empty environment. I just have storage and computing capacity, right? And like we mentioned earlier, depending on your SLAs and the requirements you have for your workloads, I may need to move some of these VMs across. These are configured in two completely different SSO domains, right? So these things are not talking to each other. And I'll show you how we get some of this information across. And then we'll be publishing this after the fact, so don't worry if you don't miss some of these things. But I basically wrote a bunch of functions. This is really leveraging out-of-the-box Power CLI commandlets, right? And again, this is just one example. I know many of our customers use Power CLI as an automation tool framework, but this is all being backed by the APIs. And so if you're a Python shop, Ruby, Go, we have all these different SDK bindings that you can leverage and create a here. So these functions, what I've done is created a bunch of functions that will export some information out there. So let me log into the environment, see if I can get this working for you guys. So I start off by logging into my source Windows vCenter server. There we go.
It's a big pond.
Yeah, it is apparently. So we'll start with some DRS rules. That's generally one that comes up quite a bit. You know, they can get very complex. It's something that you really don't want to be manually recreating. So PowerScale has this really nice command line call get DRS rules. If I can type that correctly. And if I give it a cluster name, here it's our Windows cluster. If I run the command, I should get back all the DRS rules, right? So pretty straightforward. It's not exactly in the format I wanted, because if you look here, I get the groups, whether it's an affinity or anti-affinity rules, but here I get these IDs. These are the VM IDs that's uniquely identify the VMs in the source Windows vCenter server. If I can move these VMs to my new VC, these IDs are all going to change, right? But just with a slight little adjustment, I can actually export this information and put it in the format that I want it in. So what I've done is I've created a function called export DRS rules, right? Pretty straightforward. So if I just run the export DRS rules, and I give it the cluster name again, so Windows cluster. Now if I run that, what you'll see is I've basically had that same information out there. I've actually output it as a JSON format, which means that's very easy for a human to read, but it's also very easy for a system to read, right, from an automation standpoint. Now if I rerun the exact same command, and I actually do a dash path, and give it the path of where I want this file to be exported, it will then output this as a JSON file. So I'll go ahead and just pick this directory that I'm already current CD'd into. And now if I rerun this with that parameter, you can see that I've now taken that information and exported it out to a .json file. So if I do a listing, I can see that, and if I cat the file, you can see that I have that information, right? Pretty straightforward, but I can export this out, and I may or may not need the vCenter source running.
So now you've created basically a backup of this information. Yep. So if the source is down, yep, I now have this backup.
Yep. So this can be a source of truth for you. It can be a backup for your configuration, like Ahmad said, right? And so let's go ahead and do the exact same thing for the other ones. In the spirit of time, I will expedite this, and I won't go through each of these scenarios, but you can see that each of these function does exactly that. I will go through the export tag just real quick.
We got about 5 minutes.
Okay. Oh, do we? Oh, okay, never mind. 5 minutes, let's get through this demo. So here what it's actually doing is actually calling all those functions, and it's exporting all those configurations out there. So once that's all done, and so for like tags, we're exporting things like the tags, the categories, and then the tag associations of all the objects to their respective tags. And so now if I do a listing, I have all these beautiful JSON files. If we want to cat out, say, the all tag association, for example. All right, now we have a JSON file that maps to the VM names, and we can see all the human readable tag files. And again, I'm just really taking the basic PowerScale options, doing a little bit of manipulation, and then outputting into a file, right? Pretty straightforward. Okay, so now that I'm done with my source vCenter server, I'm going to go ahead and disconnect, right? Which I've already done that, as you can see in that last statement there. Now we're ready to move the VMs across to our brand new vCenter server. So this little piece of snippet of code here calls that cross vCenter vMotion script that I mentioned. I tweaked it just a little bit where I'm basically logging into my source vCenter server, so that's line number 1. I'm also then logging into my destination VCSA, so that's my new appliance I want to connect to. And then what I'm doing is I'm basically getting all the VMs in my source VC, right? I want to migrate all the VMs. Obviously, you can filter that out. You can just migrate the VMs you care about. But here I'm just getting everything. If you want them in a priority list, you can build up this array of VMs. You can say, hey, I have some really mission critical VMs. I want those to go first. So there's a lot of options here. Here I'm just basically getting all VMs and saying I want all that across. Then I'm calling this little method called startXmove, which will then start the migration of the VMs. So if I run this function real quick, if I just refresh this UI. Here, so you can see that we've now kicked off a cross vCenter vMotion for both offline or cold migrate of the VMs as well as the hot VMs they're actually running. So now if I go back to the UI here, we can see that we've kicked off that process. So just one click of a button, I can migrate 1 VM or 10,000 VMs, right? And you can queue them up. And doesn't this beat having to talk to your application admin and saying, I need downtime from this period of time to this period of time, and you're not even sure if that's going to be down, right? So one customer said that this saved them. They said that there was no way that they can schedule this amount of downtime with their application team and stuff. And so this allowed them to not to have to worry about that challenging, move the VMs, and then tell the application owners, hey, by the way, we've just put you on faster hardware. Your application is probably going to be moving faster, and I didn't need to take any kind of downtime. So you become the superhero of your organization. So we need to let this finish a little bit. And then what we're going to do lastly is that now the workloads are into our new VCSA. We've exported all those configurations from our source vCenter server. We're now going to re-import that information. And you can see how this can be useful so that I may or may not even need the source Windows vCenter up and running, or I can have them side by side. So the nice thing about this flexibility is that I can export it and have these files offline, and I can apply that to any other environment. You had a question?
Yes, I have a question. What about networking in other vCenter? Do we need to pre-configure networking?
Right. Yeah, you definitely have to worry about networking, right? So we are live-grading the VMs, but if you don't have networking between the two vCenter servers, you're losing connectivity. So like I mentioned earlier, you do need to have that networking. That can either be a layer 2 stretch. It can be some type of an overlay network. It can even be like an NSX virtual wire, right? So NSX is a great way to basically abstract that away. And once you have that foundational networking, when I live migrate this workload, you can do a continuous ping or connect to your application, and you shouldn't have any downtime. So it does require networking.
So I'm talking not only about vMotion networking, but also about switch configuration, network switch configuration. So everything should be identical.
Yeah, it just depends on how you're setting up your network infrastructure. Like if you're setting up an L2 stretch, obviously your top of the racks, all that needs to be the same and probably same VLAN IDs. If you're doing like NSX, then these could be over L3. Okay. And then obviously the other requirement, and thank you for mentioning, is that your ESXi host needs to talk. So vCenter is the one that's doing the data management, saying, hey, move these VMs across. Once it says go and do that, it's going to find the ESXi host and say, hey, this VM lives on this ESXi host on your source Windows. This other ESX host lives on your VCSA. Their vMotion network needs to be able to talk to each other, whether that's, again, a stretch L2, or it can be over L3, because we can now do vMotion over layer 3. Yeah, so those are really the basic requirements to be able to leverage this capability.
Thank you.
Yep. If you notice too, because William has the VCSA up at the same time as his Windows vCenter server, he was able to give the VCSA a new name and get out of the whole bounding name to the platform. If he wanted to actually have the same name, he would copy the information out, shut down Windows, and now deploy the appliance with the same name.
And the nice thing about this is having things side by side means I can always check the old environment. Did I miss a folder? Did I get the resource pool, right? There are some things that are going to require some orchestration, right? I can't just create VM affinity rules without the VM objects being there, right? So you do need to export some of this information and run that in a particular order. But there are some benefits to that. So we can see here that all the VMs have migrated across, right? And my VMs that I had powered on are still powered on, and it's got its IP address. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go through the reverse of that workflow. Is now I'm going to connect to my new VCSA, and I'm going to take those JSON files that I have exported earlier, and I'm going to re-import all those configurations. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to go through this demo really quickly. And you can see here it's connected to the vCenter server appliance, and then shortly it's going to start creating the rules. And you can see the live refresh, and we're now dynamically recreating all of the DRS rules, all the different hosts and cluster rules. We're going to recreate all the tags, all the categories, and then associate all those tags back to the VM objects. We're going to create the folder structures, and we're going to move all those VMs back in. And you can see, this was, dozens so VMs, and each VM had about 3 tags. And just imagine if you're doing this for 500 VMs, where you may have a lot more tags, a lot more rules and all that. Do you really want to be doing this by hand? Are you confident that you will get it right for the first time, right? And so really leveraging automation, Power CLI is a really easy way to basically do this at scale. And so here we can kind of start, refreshing the UI. Everything's been copied over. If we kind of select one of the VMs to prove that things are actually happening, we can see the tags have been migrated across. If I click on my vSphere cluster and I click on the cluster setting, let's see if we have the cluster rules. We can see all the rules that I had shown earlier are now being shown. And then lastly, if I take a look at my folders, all the nice folder structures, you can see, and we can easily extend this thing to like permissions, roles, all this information where you've configured in a certain way. You don't want that to magically break and somehow not give access to your customers or potentially not give the right access to your customers and all that, right? So the key here is really leveraging automation, leveraging what's in the community. A lot of this content has already been pre-written. I'm going to take some of this stuff, resubmit it, and I know Kyle Ruddy from Tech Marketing has also built a bunch of code that helps customers leverage this mechanism and export various configuration settings, right? So if you guys are saying, hey, we want advanced settings, somebody can write a quick function, submit a pull request, and now you've made that available to all of your other customers and peers, and they can leverage that, right? And so it is really, really simple. And so once we're done with the session, we'll definitely publish this information. But you can see, just in a couple of minutes, I'm able to live migrate virtual machines across 2 different SSO domains. I'm able to actually perform a migration from Windows to vCSA, because you guys know that the Windows is going away. And we're giving you guys choice, right? So that even if you cannot use the vCSA migration tool, we are offering you a path forward that you can migrate from different topologies, you can do hostname changes, you can even do consolidation.
By the way, when he started out, he was using the Flex client, and he ended up now using the new H5 client that is part of the vCenter server appliance.
Jump back into this.
Which we've also announced deprecation to the Flex client as well. So. All right. So we've given you guys a demo of how to migrate. So we want to kind of give you a little bit of glimpse of what may be coming down the future.
Yeah, so I'll take the first one. So again, earlier I talked about automation. It was automation via CLI. So CLIs are easy to use and all that, but if you're trying to consume it through Power CLI or trying to consume it more programmatically or more developer friendly, it's not really the interface. And so one of the things I'm really excited about, because I've been spending a lot of my time working with our engineering team, is that we're now going to be working on, hopefully, and delivering some REST APIs. So now you'll be able to completely automate the entire lifecycle of vCSA using our nice REST APIs. And for any of you who've been using vSphere 6.0 or 6.5, you might have seen some of the new REST APIs that have been exposed on simplified VM management, accessing the VAMI interface, right? So these are really simple, easy use REST APIs, and we've extended that to all of the lifecycle management for the vCenter appliance. And so if you wanted to upgrade using the APIs, we have those capabilities, or migrate or install.
The other thing that we're looking into is today with the migration tool, we give you the option to bring over your historical and performance data. By default, configuration and inventory come over. So in 6.5, we give you a subset of ways to bring it over, but that requires downtime. And some customers want the appliance up and running as quickly as possible, and in having the data come over, piece by piece while they're actually using the appliance. So what we're looking into is that case where we can have the appliance up and running, and while it's running and you're using it, data will come in behind the scenes. Now, this is not a requirement. This will be an option. If you want to have that downtime and you're okay with the downtime, you can do so. But if you actually need the appliance up and running and have the data slowly import, then you can do so as well.
So just a quick show of hands, are these features something that you guys are interested in, that you guys want to see? No?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, there you go.
Okay. So
there are PMs up here. Let them know.
Yeah. There's actually also the PM for the platform services controller lifecycle and everything like that is back
also
there.
In the back.
Yep.
Say hi, Johnny.
Okay. And we talked about some migration resources. This is just a subset of resources that you guys can use to get you from your Windows vCenter server over to the appliance. So you have William's blog, my blog, the vSphere blog. I've also written a bunch of content on there. We've got the GitHub, which we kind of call the Bible of migration, where we have a ton of content. We'll be adding more content as time permits as well. The hands-on lab actually has a migration simulator. So if you don't have a lab where you can test the migration tool, you can use that. I've created a feature walkthrough, basically a click-by-click, step-by-step feature of the migration process. And then finally, myself and the other guys from Tech Marketing, Adam Eckerly, Kyle Ruddy, have also created some light boards that go through this process as well.
And I think we're almost up, so we probably have time for a couple of questions. If you guys have anything, just raise your hand.
I guess we don't have any questions.
That back. We will be outside. I think they want you guys to exit out of this door. We'll be outside, so if you guys have questions, just feel free to come on up. Thank you very much.
Yep.